Hello, in today's video we're going to be talking about the Bladeborn fighters from Tome of Champions 2021. For those of you who don't know, these are the fighters from Warhammer Underworlds that are being given rules for Warcry. For the most part, these fighters are just slightly different versions of existing fighters, however they come with unique abilities, different stats, and different ways to add them to your warband. I'm not going to go into too much detail as you can get all that information in the Tome of Champions, and from other preview channels that have already gone through the book, but the most exciting part is the ability to ally these warbands as a group, allowing you to bring a whole Underworlds team into any warband that shares the same Grand Alliance. This should add some exciting variety to the game and make some really cool games on the tabletop. In my opinion, all the Bladeborn teams fall into one of two categories. They're either upgraded teams, which are really just improve or side grade existing fighters, or they're a unique team that brings something new, like a fighter type or an interesting ability that adds something new to the faction's playstyle. I'll probably spend more time talking about the unique teams, for obvious reasons, but that doesn't mean that the upgraded teams are bad, there's just less to talk about. In this video, I'll talk a little bit about each team, how they function, and how I would consider using them in my Warcry warbands. First, let's look at the Order Grand Alliance. This has the most teams to talk about and a good amount of variety as well. For the Daughters of Cain, we have Morgwaith's Blade Coven, which I consider an upgrade team. This consists of a Hag Queen, a Bloodstalker, 2 Witch Elves, and a Sister of Slaughter, and clocks in around 620 points. Morgwaith trades a bit of damage for extra range, and every other fighter just gets +2 wounds compared to their basic versions. Morgwaith does get a double to have a friendly Blade Coven model make a bonus attack, but overall it's just a slight boost for a handful of models. The major downside here, I think, is that Witch Elves and Sisters of Slaughter are really good because of their low price, and by increasing their price to give them extra wounds, it kind of diminishes that bonus. But if you're floating some points anyway, it's worth the bump to give them a couple extra wounds. There's a solid combination of Morgwaith and Kyrie getting extra bow shots on a double every turn, which does seem pretty solid, and you can ally just those two into any other warband. Chemis, Kyrsa, and Lethier are potentially nice allies for elite factions like Stormcast or some of the dwarves perhaps, to get relatively cheap units on the board as well. If you're looking to expand this into just a Daughters of Cain faction, I'd probably look at either Canary for the extra speed, or just some more Witch Elves and Sisters of Slaughter to play a more Horde-style team. You could also consider picking up another leader, maybe a Gorgon or Bloodwreck Medusa. But overall, I think this is a solid team to start out with. Fire Slayers see the Chosen Axes added. This is a older Shadespire warband. They're the equivalent of a Runefather and 3 slightly different Volkites, and function really as an upgrade team. They also gain the extra wounds, and you get a little bit more damage on Vol and Fuel Grimnir. For 6 extra points over getting these models baseline, if you're thinking about bringing Volkites into Runefather, it's definitely worthwhile, but they still suffer from that same move 3 and low range that all Fire Slayers have. The Warband double gets you +2 dice on the next action if the fighter using it is near Fuel Grimnir. If you get to deploy them as a single block of Dwarf or set up on an objective together, this could be really good for punching above your weight class, but it doesn't really fundamentally change Fire Slayers. Again, if you're bringing these fighter types and have some points floating about, the wounds and ability are a solid boost. To expand this team into a full Fire Slayers faction, I'd probably look at adding some Auric Hearthguard for a bit of range support, since the faction is pretty slow overall. For the Idoneth Deepkin, we get Elthane's Soul Raid. This is the first team we're looking at that adds a brand new fighter type, actually 4 new fighters, making them a really unique warband. Elthane is basically just a better Soul Render, trades a bit of damage for more wounds and a net double, which functions just like the net abilities you've seen in the past that turn off moves and disengages. Then we get Huiran, who is an unmounted version of an Ashaelan Guard. She gets less wounds, obviously, and speed, but a much lower price point. This is a great addition to Idoneth, since they don't really have a mid-size fighter that's not a hero. Tamael has the same base stats as a regular Namarti Thrall, with a couple extra wounds, but his spear functions much more like the one in Untamed Beasts, even getting a triple to pull enemies with it, which is really solid ability when available. Dwingclaw and Spinefin are also brand new additions. Dwingclaw is something like a durable mid-sized fighter with an okay attack, and Spinefin is a very fast, squishy fighter, almost akin to an Aetherwing from Stormcast Vanguard. Spinefin's actually a great addition. I think having a cheap, fast fighter to jump onto points, grab objectives, pick up treasure, or just take up space in general, that's always worthwhile. Even if you're just throwing him in to slow down a fighter that would otherwise kill an important fighter in your warband, it's very worthwhile for 80 points. This is a warband with a lot to offer. While their fighting power isn't the strongest, they bring a lot of utility and reasonable survivability for just over 560 points. I could potentially see leaving Fuiran and Dwingclaw at home and just using the utility on Elthane and Tamael and having Spinefin as a more annoying mobile piece. I'd probably consider getting a box of Achelian Guard to add on to this warband if you want to stay within Deepkin. They'll give you a bit of extra mobility and punch. The soul rate has already a good amount of small fighters, so adding a few big cavalry pieces might work out pretty well. Hundrix Profiteers are the Caradron Overlords team. They consist of a Aether Chemist, a Thunderer with Aether Shot Rifle, a Sky Warden with a Sky Pike, and 2 Arcanauts, one with Aethermatic Volley Gun. They're also fairly expensive at over 700 points, though everyone does get the +2 wounds, and Thunder gets a shooting attack that the regular Chemist doesn't have. They also get a bonus attack in the 3rd round or later on a triple if you're near Thundrick, which isn't bad if you've already survived that late into the game, gives you a solid amount of extra damage. They function as an upgrade team. Again, if you were thinking of bringing these types of fighters anyway, paying a few more points to get the extra wounds is not a bad thing. Or paying 50 points at minimum to give your Chemist a good gun by trading the Chemist out for Thundrick. I could definitely see leaving Alanson at home since basic pistol Arcanauts aren't that great, even with a couple extra wounds on top of it. An extra box of Thunderers would give you plenty of weapon variety to round out this faction, so if you're looking to stay within Caradron, I'd probably pick up these guys and a box of Thunderers. Though I know a lot of people like Sky Wardens and Endrinriggers for a bit of speed and melee combat. Miari's Purifiers are the Sylvanath team, and it's a fairly interesting one. It's a nicely well-rounded team. Bahanar, Ailen, and Sinela give you a Stone Guard, Blade Lord, and Sentinel respectively, and again at the +2 wounds versus the other generic fighters. Miari, however, is a new type of wizard for the faction, having a similar stat line to a Stone Mage or Caligrave, but trading their abilities for his own triple ability. Puts out a -1 attack dice aura, so he works really well at fighting over a specific locale, debuffing enemies, that sort of thing. For 460 points for the 4 of them, they make a nice balanced team that you could add on to pretty easily, or potentially use them as allies in other factions. They do lack a bit of punch, really only Bahanar having good combat, so maybe you would think about adding in some Dawn Riders for damage, or you would just load up on some Wardens or Sentinels to outnumber your opponent, and try to go from there. Seraphon get the starblood stalkers, which is for the most part an upgraded team. Kishitaka is a skink star priest that trades the Tide of Serpents double for his own triple ability that gives friendly fighters +1 move and toughness. That's not a bad bit of buffing if you're just using him in the center of the board to buff a lot of fighters at the same time. Clacktrock is a Saurus Sunblood without the leader rune mark, and the 3 skinks get +2 wounds compared to their generic brethren. Otapodal is the first chameleon skink to join Warcry, though in functionality he ends up being very similar to a Bolt Spitter skink, just with a double ability that gives him a bonus move, but only if no enemy is within 12. So at a bit over 600 points, you get a good number of models, 1 reasonably solid fighter in Clacktrock, so they're definitely better than just taking the equivalent regular Seraphon. You may need to pair them with some heavier hitters, especially if you're not bringing Clacktrock for his price point. If you want to stay within Seraphon, picking up some Pterodons or Ripperdactyls for speed and damage could be solid, or maybe some Saurus Guard as a slower, more punchy option. Moving on to the Stormcast, we have 3 teams, one for each of the chambers except Thunderstrike, since Xandire's Truthseekers didn't get their own rules yet. Steelheart's Champions are the Warrior Chamber team, and they're mostly an upgrade team, but with one thing really worth talking about. Steelheart is finally a Liberator Prime with a great weapon, which was a missing unit type in Warcry, while Brightshield and Oberon are simply equivalent Liberators with +2 wounds as normal. But their big thing is that their Warband double gives them the fighter who uses it -1 damage from all hits and crits, which is really good for elite warbands. At 565 points, they're an expensive trio, but that's fairly par for the course with Stormcast, and the double is outstanding, to the point where I might consider allying in 1, 2, or all 3 of them into a more swarm-focused warband, and utilizing the double to make them very durable. The Vanguard Chamber gets the Farstriders, which is a Hunter Prime and 2 Hunters, for around 575 points together as an upgraded version of those fighters. Interestingly, they seem to be slightly cheaper than just bringing regular Hunters, despite having the customary +2 wounds, though that could be me not reading the point updates correctly. Either way, Hunters are already fairly reasonable fighters, and the Farstrider's triple makes them even better. Farstrider, the leader, can use a triple to make all friendly Farstriders within 6 inches take a bonus move. If you're grouped up, that's 1 or 2 bonus moves on good fighters for 1 ability. Though, of course, putting them all together in 1 detachment might end up with them staying off the board together until turn 3, so you might end up using this later in the game or just more sparingly in general. Finally, we have the Sacrosanct Stormcast, which are Stormsire's Cursebreakers. Together they sit just under 600 points, and are basically an upgrade of their fighters as well. Stormsire is something between a Lord Exorcist and a Knight Incantor, since he's effectively an Incantor with the Exorcist rune mark, and gets that area of effect quad that the Lord Exorcist has. However, Amos and Rastus are just evocators with customary extra wounds, and Amos gets a bit of extra crit damage. Stormsire gains an area of effect triple for potential 3 damage on everything nearby, which isn't so bad, so using him as a zone threat could be really strong. At the end of the day, all 3 of these teams are pretty much the same as taking existing fighters, though with their unique abilities that make them stand out, especially with Steelheart's champions. I would supplement any of them with cheap allies, or if you want to stay within the Stormcast faction, Gryph-hounds. Finally, for Order, we have Sylvanath, and they get 2 teams actually, both of which are very unique, Ylthari's Guardians and Skaith's Wild Hunt. Ylthari is something similar to a Branch Witch or Branch Wraith, though her quad ability to deal ability value damage in an area around her could be devastating if you get a quad 5 or 6. The rest of Ylthari's Guardians are reminiscent of Spite Revenants, though they trade the anti-move double for better wounds and combat profiles, including Anslain, who gives the cheaper shooting option to Sylvanath. This can be really nice to supplement the more expensive Bow Kurnothi, who are solid but expensive. The other Sylvanath warband is the Wild Hunt, and it consists entirely of new fighter types. You could make some comparisons to various Wanderers or other elven units in Cities of Sigmar, as they effectively function very similarly. But in essence, you get a relatively durable and fast leader with an unreliable but strong attack. You get 4 small to mid-sized fighters with good but not great damage output. Being part of Sylvanath means they get access to the healing double, which can make Skaith a fast, durable, self-healing threat, which can be really powerful in some missions. They also end up with a reasonable price point. The Wild Hunt adds up to just under 500 points, while Ylthari's Guardians sit at 440 points. This means that if you just pick up these 2 boxes, you already have a pretty solid Sylvanath Warcry warband, and you could consider picking up a box of Revenants or Dryads, which would give you a solid high body count, fairly mobile team, though one that doesn't really have any hugely reliable damage output. Chaos is the next faction, and the one with the second most teams to look at. Starting alphabetically with Beasts of Chaos, we have Grashrak's Despoilers. These are mostly an upgrade team consisting of a Great Bray Shaman, a Bestigor, 2 Ungors with Spears, and 2 Ungor Raiders. Draknar, the Bestigor, gains a whopping 6 extra wounds over a regular Bestigor, while all the Ungors get 2 wounds and an extra dice on the Spears. Grashrak jumps up 3 wounds from a regular Shaman, and his quad ability is insanely devastating. On a 2+, he can prevent a nearby enemy from activating this turn. This can be absurd if your opponent is an elite warband, allowing you to ignore a fighter or gang up on them with no repercussions. At just around 600 points, they're only slightly more expensive than the equivalent fighters, and the bonuses they get definitely seem worth it. At the very least, Grashrak's quad makes him really tempting over a regular Great Bray Shaman. To expand from here, Beasts of Chaos have a lot of options to choose. You can get more raiders for a more swarmy and shooty style of play, but I personally think Dragon Ogres can make a good choice for big beefy fighters if you like the models. Also, if you decide to leave Draknar at home, you can ally in Grashrak and the Ungors to another faction, and give a more elite faction some cheap bodies and a really good support piece. Next we have the Khorne Bloodbound, and I actually get 2 Bladeborn warbands, though they should seem pretty familiar to anyone who knows the faction already. Their abilities are worth looking at, but for the most part these stats are just upgrades for existing fighters. Magor's Fiends are just 2 Blood Warriors, a Chaos Champion, and a Flesh Hound, while Garruk's Reavers are 5 Blood Reavers and a Blood Reaver Chieftain. However, they all get the customary extra wounds, and Karsus gets a brand new weapon type that Blood Reavers don't get access to. Where these fighters really stand out is their abilities. The Reavers get a whopping 4 abilities. They get a double that boosts move, a quad that does an extra attack with a bonus dice, and all the fighters get to use those. Garruk specifically gets a double that boosts his crit damage, which can be nice, and Karsus has an area of effect triple to go with his weapon. Magor's Fiends have a damage double that hits adjacent enemies that only works for the leader, which is never terrible, but the big one is that Riptooth has a triple that has each Magor's Fiend fighter nearby take a bonus move action. Even if you're only using this to move 1 or 2 fighters, that's a solid amount of value, if you can keep all your Fiends grouped up. At the very minimum, putting the Fleshhound and 1 fighter in a detachment together and getting a free move before moving and fighting in can be really powerful. Together, these teams add up to a whopping 1,200 points, so even if you want to make a warband out of just Underworld's fighters, you have to leave a couple of them at home. But you'll end up with a pretty solid warband, having a choice of squishy Reavers, more durable Blood Warriors, and a very fast, very efficient Fleshhound. The Eyes of the Nine are the Tzeentch Arcanite team, and they're a pretty interesting one at that. They get to somewhat mix factions together by taking a Blue Horror, which is normally just a Tzeentch Demon fighter type, but other than mixing those 2 factions together, they function just as an upgrade of existing fighters. Vortimis, Narvia, and Turash are just a Magister and 2 Acolytes with no changes in stats at all for a little bit more points. Kacharik is a more expensive Zangor, but he does get +1 wound and toughness for his trouble, as well as a triple that adds half the ability value to all of his hits and crits in his next attack. This point jump for the other fighters seems to be tied up in their faction quad, which gives the fighter that uses it a bonus attack, and that bonus attack gets extra dice and strength if you're using the ranged magical blast attacks. It's kind of middling for Narvia, Turash, and the Blue Horror to use that quad, but if you're using it on Vortimis and boosting his regular wizard blast, it could potentially make a pretty solid turret if you can set him up in the middle of the board. At 590 points altogether, you're missing some real oomph, some real hitting power, so consider mixing in a big hero or maybe some enlightened for damage. Alternatively, you can go body heavy and pick up a box of Zangors and swarm the board while Vortimis fires off magic and the little guys run around holding objectives. The Wormspat is a pretty small warband, just 3 fighters for Nurgle Rotbringers coming in at 475 points, and it's very much an upgraded team. Fecula is a tougher, stronger sorcerer, and while Gulgach is basically just a straight upgraded Blight King, Sepsimus is more of a side grade to the same fighter. Fecula gets a double for a bonus attack with her Magical Blast, which is really solid. Getting a bonus attack on a double is pretty rare, but it's only once per game to balance it out. Much like some of the other teams we've talked about, this is another one of those teams where if you're already thinking about bringing a sorcerer and some Blight Kings, consider bringing these guys for the extra stats, but they don't really change much about the faction, still suffering from being very elite and very slow. I think the best way to round out the worm spat is actually to take another cheaper Bladeborn team to get extra bodies, such as the Skaven or the Beasts of Chaos. But then, if you're looking to stay within the faction, you might as well just lean into the eliteness and pick up 2 Pusgoyle Blight Lords, and it gives you a little bit of mobility. Slaanesh Sybarites are a faction that's relatively new to the lore, and the Dread Pageant are a great addition to that faction. We have our first brand new Chaos Fighter with Glizette, who is something like a faster but squishier Symbaresh Twin Soul. Hadzus, Slakeslash, and Vasilak are all much better versions of their generic cousins, and the faction quad is solid. You get a bonus attack on a quad, but you get extra dice depending on whether the friendly fighter is wounded, the enemy target is wounded, or both of you are. There's not much more to talk about other than, again, if you're thinking about bringing a Blissbarb Archer or a Slangor, consider bringing these fighters instead for the stat boost. They weigh in at a bit over 600 points, and you might want some more bodies to fill that gap. Maybe you pick up some Blissbarb Archers to do some positional shooting type of play, or you could go very elite, pick up a couple more Slangors, and just fill out with those big cow demons. Spikeclaw's Swarm is the Skaven warband, and it's one of the older teams in Underworlds. I would consider them relatively unique, thanks to Scritch's ability and Kirk being somewhat blended of a fighter type. They're pretty cheap, rocking it at 475 points for 5 fighters, but none of the Bladeborn here are particularly powerful. Kirk and Scritch aren't terrible, they're roughly equivalent to a Storm Vermin and a Claw Leader respectively, with Kirk picking up the Agile rune mark that Clan Rats get. The 3 Clan Rats are better versions of their generic broodmates, with the standard +2 wounds that most Bladeborn fighters get. I think in essence, this team ends up being more of a utility group. Scritch gets a triple that allows him to return any of the smaller Skaven to the battlefield, just like Soulblight Gravelords get to do a resurrection. Everyone has the Agile rune mark to make the Scurry Away double, so at the end of the day they have movement, utility, the ability to res a few fighters, so I think you're going to get a lot of interesting play out of these fighters. I think you will see these guys being used as allies for a more elite team and using their utility to play objective game or run interference, but if you want to use them inside Skaven, I would consider picking up some big fighters like Storm Vermin or Rat Ogres. Finally for Chaos, we have Slaves to Darkness, and they got some interesting additions with their Bladeborn. Kagra's Ravagers is an upgraded team with 3 straightforward fighters. Kagra is a slightly better side grade to an aspiring champion, while Razik and Kragan are just Chaos Warriors with an extra wound. However, you have Zarshia, who's interesting in that she's a sorcerer lord that doesn't count as a leader, giving you another wizard, and one with 2 new spell abilities. Her double is a pretty straightforward damage spell with some potential backlash if you roll poorly, and her triple is a friendly teleport spell, similar to what the Cypher Lords get, making her basically just a better sorcerer for the points. The Ravager's quad gives a bonus attack that's better when you're on an objective, which is where you want to be fighting anyways, so their overall package of fighters is good and more or less a straight buff compared to regular Chaos Warriors. On the flip side, you have the Godsworn Hunt, which is very unique and made up of effectively entirely new fighter types. They're very similar to Marauders for their base stats, movement, toughness, and wounds, but they have better combat, some ranged power, and they have a wizard leader who gets a debuffing triple. Her ability reduces an enemy's toughness, which can really turn the tide against elite warbands. The Hunt gives you access to a small hound and 4 Marauder alternatives, and while none of them are extremely powerful, it can add a lot of variation to your existing Slaves to Darkness builds. The Ravagers come in around 625 points, and the Godsworn Hunt around 650 points, so you can put them together and remove a couple fighters, and you'd have a solid start for any Slaves to Darkness warband. Next, let's move on to the Death Grand Alliance, and there's only 4 factions in here, but all of them get some solid additions with Bladeborn. First, we have the Grimwatch, which are the Flesh Eater Quartz warband. Overall, the faction should look very familiar as an upgrade. 5 of these fighters are just slight variations on ghouls. All of them get +2 wounds over their base versions, and all of them have some amount of variance between attack, strength, and damage on their weapons over regular ghouls. Duke Crackmarrow is effectively just a Crypt Ghast Courtier with extra wounds and a little bit of extra range. He can pop a double to make a friendly nearby grimwatch make an attack, so if you get stuck in and your guys don't die, especially if you get Gristlewell in there, you can put out some extra damage. The Harriers are kind of a new unit type. They're a variation on the Bat Swarm Death Thrall profile, which you may or may not have seen if you use Thralls in your games. Ultimately, the Grimwatch act as a way to beef up your ghouls, especially if you're tired of not having anything bigger than a ghoul or smaller than a Flayer or Horror. These give you something a little bit more on the mid-size. The Grimwatch together clock in around 565 points, so adding in 1 or 2 big Flesh Eater fighters can work, or you might consider allying in some of the more elite Bladeborn that we'll talk about in a second. The nighthaunt have Thorns of the Briar Queen as their Bladeborn, and they're quite straightforward as far as upgraded teams go. 4 of them are just Chain Rasps with better damage, and the Everhanged is just a better Chain Rasp. Varklav ends up being effectively a Dread Warden without the leader rune mark, and the Briar Queen is a slightly modified Tomb Banshee. At the very minimum, the Queen gets a neat triple that can deal damage and reduce enemy move speed, but ultimately there's not much here that will change the playstyle of Nighthaunt altogether. The Thorns together add up around 750 points, so you're most of the way to a warband already just with this kit. It's worth noting that both the easy-to-build Mirnmorn Banshees and the Glavewraith Stalkers are playable factions in Underworlds, but they didn't get Bladeborn rules since the models are the same in both games. So, if you have Lady Harrow's Mournflight or Drepper's Wraith Creepers for Warhammer Underworlds, you can round out your Nighthaunt team pretty easily. On the other hand, the Bone Reapers have a fairly unique Bladeborn team in Kainen's Reapers. Kainen himself is something like a bigger, tougher, stronger Mortison Soul Reaper, and his squad gives him an extra bonus attack action. Binar Kenta, Senha, Karu, and Hakor are better or side-grade versions of Mortek units in general, but interestingly they also get Nohem, who's a Mortek with a bow, the first of his kind. This is one of the few true ranged options available for death at all, and while his attack is about as middling as you would expect from a regular lineman with a bow, it's still something unique that can add some interest to your Bone Reaper builds or as an ally to other death builds. Overall, they add up to just under 700 points for a relatively unique and solid Bone Reaper core build, so almost any OBR box you buy will fill out the warband pretty well. I think if you drop a fighter to add in 2 Morghast or 2 Stalkers, it could be really strong as those give you big fighters to supplement your smaller Mortek. Finally for death, Soul Blight are one of the few factions that get 2 Bladeborn teams, the slightly older Sepulchral Guard and the ever-popular Crimson Court. The Sepulchral Guard at first glance just seem like upgraded skeletons, but the Warden, the Prince, and the Champion are actually better than Graveguard, though with different rune marks. The Harvester and the Petitioners are more like regular skeletons, but with more wounds as usual. The faction gets a triple they can all use, which gives a bonus move if they're within 6 inches of an enemy, similar to what Orc War Clans get. This gives a little bit of extra movement to a very slow faction, and especially getting in the Prince or the Champion or the Warden can be very, very useful. The Crimson Court are a solid and a unique addition to the Soulblight Gravelords as well. While Prince Duval is effectively just a slightly different Vampire Lord, the other 3 are somewhere in between a Vampire Lord and a Virkos Bloodborne, meaning you effectively have Vampire Knights on foot. They get a faction double for +1 dice and strength if they fight someone wounded, which you often do, so that's a really powerful double. Duval gets a double that he can use himself that gives out extra crit damage and an aura, so their damage potential is also very high if you fight as a group. Soulblight Gravelords already had a good amount of fighter variety, but the court gives you some fighter options that are bigger than Graveguard or Virkos Bloodborne without getting super expensive like Blood Knights or Kosairagi Night Guard. The Guard come out to 510 points, while the Court are 590 points, so just dropping 1 or 2 fighters gives you a warband that should perform just fine while staying fully Bladeborn. Overall, I think the Soulblight Gravelords got the best deal out of Bladeborn fighters for death. Every fighter seems worthwhile, and you can make a solid team just out of these excellent Underworld kits alone. Next we've got Destruction, and they might have gotten the most interesting additions from the Tome of Champions. Gloomspite gets lucked out hard. They get 3 Bladeborn teams, including some brand new fighter types. Zarbag's Gits are the most straightforward upgrades of the 3. Zarbag himself has the same stats as a web spinner shaman, but his double forces enemies to do a disengage or take damage, giving another solid wizard option for gits with a lot of utility. Drigzit is basically a hyper-buffed squig herder, while Bonecracka, Gobbleluck, Prog, Stickit, Redcap, and Dibs are again the same as their generic versions but with more wounds. Snurk, however, is a new Warcry fighter because they don't have fanatics. He's a solid fighter right off the bat, squishy but with a solid attack, but then you factor in that his quad deals ability damage in an area around him, and he can be really scary if you get him in the middle of enemy fighters. Mollog's Mob is probably the most unique addition of all the Bladeborn fighters across any alliance. First, you have Mollog, who's probably one of the most expensive fighters in the game, with a stat line that justifies being a full third of your points, especially if you burn abilities to make his 2-dice attack a little bit more reliable. His Bat Squig pet is a squig with more wounds and higher speed, but instead of his other squig pets getting rules, they act as tokens for his abilities. You can use a double to throw down the Stalag Squig, and it creates a trap that deals 2d6 damage to the first enemy that moves next to it, while he has a triple that throws down the Spite Shroom, and it sets up a zone of -1 dice for enemy attacks. He's bloody expensive, but he has zone denial and debuffs as well as a really crazy stat line. Finally, we have Rippus Snarlfangs. These are also quite unique, but while Mollog has a massive stat line and unique abilities, the Snarlfangs are unique in that they're the first Git mob grots we've seen since AOS released. Their stat lines are fairly standard for light or medium cavalry, and there's nothing within Gits to directly compare them to, since they're quite different from the Spider Riders. But they're all reasonable fighters. Tough, fast, and good, but not great attacks. They all get a roll dice for damage type of double, and an impact damage for a quad, so there's some utility in doing some chip damage while they're doing their thing. Zarbag's Gits add up to 980 points, Mollog is around 535, and Rippus Snarlfangs are around 425. So you have plenty of room to mix and match these fighters if you're just sticking within Gloomspite Bladeborn. Heck, you could even get Zarbag and play his Gits right off the shelf. Though personally I love the idea of mixing the cool parts of each team, maybe taking Mollog, some smaller fighters, and 1 or 2 cavalry pieces. Hrothgorn and his Man-Trappers are the Ogre Maw Tribe unique warband, and they're a doozy. Hrothgorn is effectively a new fighter type. Thematically, he looks like an Icebrow Hunter, but he acts more as a side grade. He actually loses 2 wounds compared to the Hunter, but he gains a much stronger shooting attack in the process, making him much more of a ranged threat than the classic Hunter. You have Thrafnir, who is basically just an upgraded Frost Saber, and the Noblars are something special compared to the regular Noblars. Lugged and Thwack get 4 extra wounds and a better weapon. Bushwhacka trades some combat for a much better trap double ability, and Quiv gets extra range and damage, but most importantly, Quiv can use a triple to make Hrothgorn take a bonus ranged attack as long as they're close together. I think people are going to start being afraid to see Quiv and Hrothgorn in the same detachment, and you might even see just the 2 of them allied in to another faction to put out some ranged threat. Overall, the Noblars are very different compared to baseline Noblars, especially if you're using their abilities, and Hrothgorn finds himself somewhere between a Hunter and a Thunderfist, which makes him a potent threat in a lot of ways. This warband adds up to 630 points, which doesn't leave a lot of room with how expensive Ogres are. You could round it out by filling up with more Noblars, though I think 2 Frost Sabers might be better. You could also drop 1 or 2 fighters, add in more Ogres, and just kind of lean into the eliteness of the team, but it gives you a lot more fighting power. The Bone Splitters team, Headcracker's Mad Bob, is fairly interesting in that they don't get an extra wounds or anything, but they're still mostly an upgrade team. Instead, the Moorboys and the Arrowboy get slightly better combat, and Headcracker himself gets access to a couple new abilities. His triple marks an enemy, and they take extra crit damage from other Bone Splitters, while his quad does really good damage against an enemy within 12 inches, or even more damage against an enemy within 3 inches. I would consider always taking Headcracker over a regular Wargog Prophet, as his abilities are very good for only 5 extra points. The whole warband rounds out together at 565 points, and there's plenty of room for additions. Luckily for Bone Splitters, the Savage Orc box lets you build a whole bunch of different fighter options, including the very excellent Banner Bearer and Big Stabbas, or you can build a bunch of Spear Boys and just load up on bodies. Last but not least, we come to the Iron Jaws. They get two pretty straightforward teams that are upgraded. Morgoth's Crushes are souped up brutes and Iron Skull's boys are souped up Ard boys. There's not really much to talk about with the Crushes. If you're considering brutes, they're basically side grades, a little bit more expensive, a few extra wounds. Sadly, their triple is mostly useless, as it only works against gargantuan creatures, which don't really show up except in monster fights. Likewise, Iron Skull and his boys are just straight better Ard boys for some extra points. They get access to an extremely powerful double, however. They reduce all incoming hits and crits by 1. This makes them excellent at doing what orcs love to do, which is running forward, fighting, and not dying. And it makes Gurzag himself a really hard target to take down while he punches everything he can reach. The boys come to 530 points while the Crushes land at 605, giving you plenty to play with for a warband just out of these two boxes alone. However, you'll be a pretty slow and elite team, but that's kind of an Iron Jaws problem in general, and these teams don't do much to fix that. You may find a little bit more interest mixing one of them with Gits in some capacity to get some cheaper bodies to supplement the more elite, powerful fighters. And that's it. That's all 32 Bladeborn teams currently out in the Tome of Champions 2021. I hope we see more additions for Harrowdeep, as I think the Truthseekers, the Cunnin Crew, and the Buccaneers could be awesome additions to Warcry as well. I think there's enough new and interesting stuff that the game is better off for this edition, and I'm really excited to try out some of my teams. Overall, I would say the balance of the fighters and abilities seems pretty solid, or at least in line with most of the rest of Warcry's balance. For hardcore tournament players, there's only a few things that jump out at me as being broken enough to make it into top tier lists, but for everybody else who's just playing casually or narrative games or with their friends, I don't think you could go wrong with picking up the book and trying out new combinations. For the most part, I would consider any two teams of the same alliance put together to be around the level of a Warcry box team, or alternatively, any Bladeborn team plus one box from their faction fills out to about the same power level. There are some outliers, of course, but that's kind of Warcry in a nutshell, and I don't think this is really designed to rebalance the game so much as just give you something to do with your models and bring a little bit of variety. I think this was a great addition by Games Workshop, and I'm very much looking forward to playing some games. If you're interested in playing as well, or disagree with some of my opinions, pop a comment down below. Keep an eye on the channel, subscribe, hit the bell, etc., whatever, and we'll put out some Warcry on here eventually. Thanks for watching, and I hope you had a good time.